The stage is set, the silence breaks, and the legend returns. Welcome to Echoes of Stories, where timeless tales find new breath. Tonight, we delve deeper into the Count of Monte Cristo, Alexandre Dumas' masterwork of revenge and redemption. First serialized in 1844, this version is drawn faithfully from Project Gutenberg's public domain archives. The next chapter beckons. This is The Count of Monte Cristo, Episode 16. Had the Count of Monte Cristo spent more time immersed in Parisian society, he might have grasped the full weight of M. de Villefort's recent decision. Villefort stood firmly within the court's favor, regardless of whether the reigning monarch hailed from the elder or younger royal line. His reputation remained intact through shifts in political climate, be it doctrinaire liberalism or staunch conservatism. He was widely seen as a man of talent, a perception often granted to those untouched by political failure. Though many despised him, others offered strong support. Yet, he was not truly liked by anyone. His role in the magistracy was significant, and he held on to his status with the same authority once shown by figures like Harley or Mole. Inside his home, the presence of a youthful wife and a daughter from his first marriage, barely 18, brought a sense of renewal. Still, his drawing room remained one of the few Parisian salons where tradition reigned. Customs were honored, and etiquette was strictly observed. Villefort's demeanor reflected a cold politeness. He showed unwavering loyalty to government ideals. He dismissed theories and theorists with disdain, and he harbored a deep-rooted aversion to anything idealistic. These traits shaped both his personal and professional life. M. de Villefort was more than just a magistrate. He carried himself like a diplomat. His respectful ties to the former royal court earned him esteem from the current one. He possessed a wealth of knowledge, and because of that, people didn't just regard him with caution. They sometimes sought his counsel. It wasn't that he couldn't be removed from power. Rather, like rebellious feudal barons, he occupied a fortress no one could breach. That fortress was his role as king's attorney, a position he wielded with remarkable finesse. He would only have surrendered it to become a deputy, trading neutrality for active opposition. In social circles, Villefort rarely made or returned visits. His wife handled those duties, and society accepted this arrangement. People believed his demanding role justified his absence, though in truth, it was calculated pride. It was a display of superiority, a living example of the modern axiom: pretend to think well of yourself, and the world will think well of you. This belief had replaced the ancient Greek ideal of know thyself with a more practical skill, knowing others. To his allies, Villefort was a formidable protector. To his adversaries, he remained a silent yet bitter foe. For everyone else, he was simply the embodiment of law. His posture was proud, his gaze either unreadable or sharply invasive. His fortune stood firm, built upon the foundation of 4 political revolutions. Villefort was known as one of the least curious and least tiresome men in France. He hosted a ball once a year, appearing for just 15 minutes, 45 less than the king himself. He avoided theaters, concerts, and public gatherings. On rare occasions, he played whist, but only with partners of high status: ambassadors, archbishops, princes, presidents, or aging duchesses. This was the man whose carriage had just arrived at the Count of Monte Cristo's residence. As the valet announced his name, the Count was bent over a large table, tracing a route from St. Petersburg to China on a map. Villefort entered with the solemn precision of a courtroom appearance. He was the same man once seen as assistant attorney in Marseilles, now fully evolved. Nature had followed his chosen path without deviation. His frame had grown gaunt, his complexion shifted from pale to yellow. His eyes were sunken, and the gold-rimmed glasses seemed fused to his face. He wore black from head to toe, save for a white tie. The only hint of color was a thin red ribbon in his buttonhole, resembling a faint stroke of blood. Though composed, Monte Cristo couldn't help but study the magistrate with intense curiosity. Villefort, skeptical by nature and doubtful of social marvels, was far more inclined to view the noble stranger as a wandering adventurer or a fugitive than as a prince of the church or a sultan from a tale of wonder. Villefort spoke with the high-pitched tone often adopted by magistrates during formal speeches, a voice they rarely shed in casual settings. He expressed his gratitude to Monte Cristo for the help rendered to his wife and son, calling it a duty to offer thanks. Yet, even in this moment of appreciation, Villefort's gaze retained its usual arrogance. His posture and voice echoed the rigid formality of a courtroom, making him appear like a living statue of the law. Monte Cristo responded with a cold demeanor. He acknowledged the fortune of saving a child for his mother, calling maternal love sacred. He subtly remarked that Villefort's gesture of thanks, though honorable, paled in comparison to the satisfaction he felt from his own conscience. Villefort, taken aback by this unexpected reply, reacted as if struck through his armor. A curl of his lip revealed his judgment. He no longer considered the Count a refined gentleman. Seeking a new topic, Villefort noticed the map on the table and commented on Monte Cristo's apparent interest in geography. The Count confirmed, explaining that he studied humanity as a whole, much like Villefort studied individuals. He believed it was easier to understand the parts by first grasping the whole, comparing his method to an algebraic principle. He then invited Villefort to sit, gesturing toward a chair that the magistrate had to pull forward himself, while Monte Cristo casually reclined back into his own. Villefort, catching his breath like a wrestler facing a strong opponent, remarked that if he had no responsibilities, he might choose a more entertaining pursuit. Monte Cristo replied that mankind, when viewed under a solar microscope, resembled an unpleasant creature. He then questioned whether Villefort truly believed his work amounted to anything meaningful. Villefort was stunned by this bold challenge, having never heard such a paradox before. Attempting to defend his profession, Villefort explained that justice in France followed a cautious and deliberate path, unlike the swift judgments of more barbaric regions. Monte Cristo agreed, referencing ancient ideas and stating that he had studied justice across many nations. He found that primitive laws, especially the law of retaliation, often aligned more closely with divine justice. Villefort noted that such a system would simplify legal codes and reduce the workload of magistrates. Monte Cristo observed that human progress tends towards simplicity, which he considered the essence of perfection. Villefort continued, describing the complexity of French law, shaped by various historical influences, and the effort required to master it. Monte Cristo agreed, but added that he had studied not only French law, but also the legal systems of England, Turkey, Japan, and India. He claimed that compared to his own knowledge, Villefort had much to learn. Curious, Villefort asked what motivated such extensive study. Monte Cristo smiled and pointed out Villefort's narrow view of society. He criticized the tendency to focus solely on social structures and official titles, ignoring those with divine missions rather than assigned roles. He likened this blindness to historical examples, Tobias mistaking an angel for a man, and nations misjudging Attila's purpose. Only when these figures revealed their true nature did people recognize their divine essence. Villefort, now deeply puzzled and suspecting he was speaking to either a mystic or a madman, asked if Monte Cristo considered himself one of those extraordinary beings. Monte Cristo responded with a cold calm, asking simply, "And why not?" Villefort, clearly stunned, apologized, and admitted he hadn't expected to meet someone whose intellect and insight far exceeded the norm. He remarked that in their corrupted society, it was rare to find wealthy individuals, like Monte Cristo was rumored to be, who spent time pondering social structures or engaging in philosophical reflection meant to comfort the less fortunate. The Count challenged Villefort's assumptions. He asked whether the magistrate had truly reached his position without ever encountering exceptions. Shouldn't a man of law be more than just an administrator? Shouldn't he be able to read hearts, detect deception, and distinguish true character from false appearances? Villefort confessed he had never heard anyone speak as Monte Cristo did. The Count explained that Villefort's worldview was limited by routine and convention. He had never dared to explore the higher realms where exceptional beings dwell. Villefort asked if such beings truly existed and mingled among ordinary people. Monte Cristo replied that they did, though invisible, just like the air we breathe. Sometimes, he said, they take physical form, interact with others, and even speak. Villefort joked that he'd like to be warned when one of these beings was near. Monte Cristo told him he had already been warned twice. Villefort asked if Monte Cristo considered himself one of these marked beings. The Count affirmed it. He explained that no man had ever stood where he stood. Unlike kings, whose domains are limited by geography or culture, his realm was the entire world. He belonged to no nation, claimed no allegiance, and recognized no brotherhood. He was free from the constraints that bind others. He described himself as a cosmopolite. Ali believed him to be Arab, Bertuccio thought him Roman, and Hades saw him as Greek. Because he was of no country and asked no government for protection, he faced no barriers. Only time and distance stood as his adversaries, and even they could be overcome. The third and greatest obstacle was mortality. That alone could halt his progress. Everything else he had reduced to calculation. Fate, ruin, and change, he had accounted for them all. Unless death intervened, he would remain unchanged. Monte Cristo claimed that even kings feared Villefort, but he did not. In a society as flawed as theirs, everyone wondered if they might one day face the king's attorney. Villefort asked if Monte Cristo, as a resident of France, wasn't subject to French law. The Count agreed, but explained that whenever he entered a country, he studied its people, especially those he might need to fear or rely on. He learned their nature, often better than they knew themselves. So, if he ever had to deal with the king's attorney, that man would be more troubled than he. Villefort hesitated, suggesting that all men have faults. Monte Cristo replied, faults or crimes. Villefort then asked if Monte Cristo considered himself perfect. The Count denied it. He was not perfect, only impenetrable. He offered to end the conversation if its tone displeased Villefort. But Villefort, unwilling to retreat, said the discussion had elevated them beyond casual talk. He compared it to theological debate, where harsh truths are sometimes spoken. Then, with a mix of admiration and challenge, Villefort said, "My brother, you sacrifice greatly to pride. You may be above others, but above you there is God." Monte Cristo's voice deepened as he replied, "Above us all, sir." The weight of his tone made Villefort shudder involuntarily. The Count admitted to holding pride when dealing with men, likening them to serpents, always poised to strike unless crushed. Yet, he set aside that pride before God, who had lifted him from nothing and shaped him into what he had become. Villefort, moved by the gravity of the moment, addressed him as Count for the first time. He acknowledged Monte Cristo's strength, superiority, and spiritual depth. If the Count truly embodied those traits, then pride was justified. It was the mark of greatness. Still, Villefort sensed ambition within him and asked what form it took. Monte Cristo confessed he had ambition. He described a moment, shared by all men at least once, when Satan had taken him to the highest mountain and offered him dominion over all the kingdoms of the world. Satan asked what he desired in exchange for worship. The Count, haunted by ambition, replied that he had heard of providence but had never seen proof of its existence. He wished to become providence itself, to reward and punish. Satan responded that providence did exist, but remained unseen, working through hidden forces. He offered to make Monte Cristo one of its agents. The Count accepted, even at the cost of his soul, and if given the chance again, he would make the same choice. Villefort stared at him in astonishment. He asked whether Monte Cristo had any family. The Count answered that he was alone in the world. Villefort called that unfortunate. When Monte Cristo asked why, Villefort explained that having loved ones might humble him. He then asked if the Count feared death. Monte Cristo clarified that he didn't fear death. He only acknowledged that death was the one force capable of halting his plans. Villefort pressed further. What about old age? Monte Cristo replied that his goals would be fulfilled before age could touch him. Villefort's final question was about madness. Monte Cristo admitted he had come close to madness once, but he invoked a legal axiom, non bis in idem, suggesting that such a fate would not strike him twice. Villefort, being a magistrate, understood the full weight of that statement. Villefort continued, pointing out that beyond death, aging, and madness, there existed another threat: apoplexy. He described it as a sudden strike that doesn't kill, but ends everything. A person remains physically present, yet becomes a lifeless shell. Someone once graceful and near angelic, like Ariel, is reduced to a brute form, like Caliban. This transformation, he explained, is what people call apoplexy. He then invited Monte Cristo to visit his home, offering a chance to continue their debate with someone capable of understanding and eager to challenge him. Villefort spoke of his father, Noirtier de Villefort, a fierce Jacobin from the French Revolution. Though Noirtier hadn't seen all the kingdoms of the world, he had helped dismantle one. He believed himself an agent of fate, not of God. But a single blood vessel rupture had erased all that in an instant. The night before, Noirtier had been a bold revolutionary, laughing at death and upheaval. He saw France as a chessboard ready to topple kings. By morning, he was a silent, paralyzed figure, dependent on his granddaughter Valentine. His body lived on, unaware of its own decay. Monte Cristo responded solemnly. He said such a sight was not unfamiliar to him. As a physician, he had searched for the soul in both living and dead matter. Though he had never seen it, he felt its presence. Many thinkers had drawn the same comparisons Villefort had made. He acknowledged that a father's suffering could deeply affect a son's perspective. He agreed to visit, accepting the invitation to witness this painful reality. Villefort explained that the sorrow had been softened by a divine compensation. While his father neared death, two young lives were just beginning. Valentine, his daughter from his first marriage, and Edward, the boy whose life Monte Cristo had saved that very day. Monte Cristo asked what Villefort concluded from this contrast. Villefort replied that he believed his father had committed a sin unknown to human law, but recognized by divine justice. God, in mercy, had chosen to punish only him. Monte Cristo smiled, but deep within, he released a silent groan so intense that, had Villefort heard it, he might have fled in terror. The magistrate rose and took his leave, expressing his esteem and hoping it would be well received once they knew each other better. He assured Monte Cristo that he wasn't one to burden his friends and reminded him that Madame de Villefort now considered the Count a lifelong friend. Monte Cristo bowed and walked Villefort to the door of his study. 2 footmen, summoned by a signal, escorted the magistrate to his carriage with great care. Once alone, The Count exhaled deeply and murmured, "Enough of this poison. Let me now seek the antidote." He rang for Ali and instructed him calmly, "I am going to Madame's chamber. Have the carriage ready at 1 o'clock." The Count of Monte Cristo's cherished acquaintances in Rue Meslay were none other than Maximilian, Julie, and Emmanuel. The mere thought of visiting them brought a radiant calm to his face, a rare lightness that softened the shadows of his inner turmoil. After Villefort's departure, his mind drifted toward the joy awaiting him, a brief escape from the storm of vengeance he had chosen to pursue. Even Ali, upon entering, was struck by the Count's unusually bright expression. With reverent silence, the loyal Nubian tiptoed away, careful not to disturb the serenity enveloping his master. At noon, Monte Cristo reserved an hour for Haydée's chambers, easing himself into joy through gentle transitions. Her rooms, separate from his, reflected Eastern elegance. Turkish carpets, silk-draped walls, and divans adorned with soft cushions. Haydée, attended by 3 French maids and 1 Greek, remained in her rose-lit boudoir, reclining on blue satin cushions, drawing fragrant smoke from a narghileh. Her attire, traditional to Paris, revealed delicate feet and a graceful figure, adorned with pearls, diamonds, and vibrant scarves. Her beauty, untouched by ornament, radiated pure Grecian charm. She was just 19 in the full bloom of youth. Monte Cristo sent word through her Greek attendant, and Haydée responded by unveiling the curtain to her chamber. As he entered, she greeted him with warmth and questioned his formality. He reminded her of her freedom in France, but she insisted she wished to see no one but him. Their exchange revealed deep affection. Haydée's love rooted in devotion, not mere habit. She spoke of her father and the Count as the only men she had ever known, and when asked where Monte Cristo resided in her heart, she answered, "Everywhere." She offered her cheek instead of her hand, a gesture of innocent intimacy. Monte Cristo explained her freedom within the mansion, her choice of attire, and her liberty to go wherever she pleased. He asked only that she keep her past and lineage secret. Haydée promised, reaffirming her desire for solitude. He encouraged her to adapt to Parisian life, as she had in other cities. She responded with emotion, hoping they would return east together. He assured her that any separation would never be his choice. She declared she could not live without him, comparing her love to the bond she had with her father, but deeper still. When asked if she could adjust to this new life, she replied that seeing him daily was all she needed. Her heart, filled with sorrow, love, and gratitude, left no room for boredom. Monte Cristo praised her poetic spirit, promising to protect her youth and honor her as a daughter. But Haydée corrected him. Her love was not that of a child. If he died, she would die too. Touched, the Count offered his hand, which she kissed with reverence. With his heart full, Monte Cristo departed to meet Morel's family, whispering lines from Pindar about youth and love. He stepped into his carriage, which sped away with its usual swift grace. Within minutes, the Count of Monte Cristo arrived at number 7, Rue Meslay. The house, built of white stone, stood behind a small courtyard adorned with 2 flower beds in full bloom. At the gate, the concierge Cockles appeared, an old acquaintance of the Count. But time had dimmed Cockles' single eye, and he failed to recognize the visitor. Carriages approaching the house had to turn aside to avoid a fountain nestled in a rocky basin, home to gold and silver fish. This elegant feature had earned the residents the nickname the Little Versailles. Emmanuel had purchased the entire property, which included a vast workshop, 2 garden pavilions, and the garden itself. He kept the house and half the garden for himself, cleverly walling off the rest to lease out. For a modest cost, He enjoyed privacy and comfort equal to the grandest homes in Faubourg Street Germain. Inside, the rooms reflected refined taste. Oak for the breakfast room, mahogany and blue velvet in the salon, citron wood and green damask in the bedroom. Emmanuel had a study he never used, and Julie had a music room she never played in. The second floor belonged to Maximilian, mirroring his sister's layout but with a billiard room in place of a breakfast parlor. He was outside, overseeing his horses grooming and smoking a cigar when the Count's carriage arrived. Cockles opened the gate, and Baptistin asked if the family would receive the Count of Monte Cristo. Maximilian, thrilled, tossed his cigar and rushed to greet the Count, his handshake full of warmth and sincerity. It was clear the Count had been eagerly awaited. Maximilian insisted on guiding the Count himself, explaining that Julie was in the garden tending roses, while Emmanuel sat nearby reading his newspapers. Wherever Julie was, Emmanuel was never far. As they approached, Julie, now Madame Emmanuel Herbault, looked up from a rose tree, surprised by the stranger's presence. Maximilian laughed, assuring her the Count was already familiar with fashionable women of the Marais. Julie playfully scolded her brother for the unexpected introduction and called out to Penelon. The old sailor, weathered by years at sea, approached respectfully, still calling her Mademoiselle Julie, unable to adjust to her new title. She asked him to inform Emmanuel of the visitor, while Maximilian led the Count to the salon. Then, without waiting for a reply, Julie slipped away through a side path, disappearing into the house. Monte Cristo quietly remarked to Maximilian that his presence seemed to stir quite a commotion in the household. Maximilian laughed, pointing out Emmanuel, who was hurriedly swapping his jacket for a coat, and assured the Count that he was already well known in Rue Maslay. The Count, observing the cheerful energy around him, noted how happy the family appeared. Maximilian confirmed it with pride. He described how they lacked nothing essential for happiness: youth, affection, and a modest income of 25,000 francs a year, which they considered wealth enough to rival Rothschild. Monte Cristo gently observed that such a sum wasn't large, though his tone carried the warmth of paternal wisdom. He asked whether Emmanuel was a lawyer or a doctor. Maximilian explained that Emmanuel had taken over the business of his late father, Morel, who had left 500,000 francs to be divided between his two children. Emmanuel, marrying Julie with no fortune of his own, had worked tirelessly to match her inheritance. Over 6 years, he earned 250,000 francs through honest labor and unwavering integrity. Their journey was slow but deliberate, choosing to preserve the customs of their family rather than chase rapid success. Their efforts earned admiration throughout Marseilles. One day, Emmanuel approached Julie after completing the final accounts. Cockles had handed him the last 100-franc roll, marking the completion of their financial goal. Emmanuel asked Julie if she could be content with their modest fortune. He explained that their business generated 1,000,000 francs annually, yielding 40,000 in income, and that M. Delaunay had offered 300,000 francs to merge the business. Julie responded that the Morel name should remain in Morel hands, even if it meant sacrificing profit. Emmanuel agreed, and they decided to close the office immediately. At 3 o'clock, they ceased operations. 15 minutes later, a merchant arrived to insure 2 ships, offering a clear profit of 15,000 francs. Emmanuel directed him to Delaunay, stating they had left business just a quarter of an hour earlier. Maximilian concluded the story, explaining that this was why his sister and brother-in-law now lived on 25,000 francs a year. As Maximilian finished recounting the story, Monte Cristo's heart swelled with emotion. Emmanuel entered, dressed formally, and greeted the Count with respectful warmth. After guiding him through the small garden, Emmanuel returned to the house. Inside the salon, A large Japanese porcelain vase overflowed with fragrant flowers. Julie, now elegantly dressed with her hair neatly arranged in just minutes, welcomed the Count. Birds sang from a nearby aviary, and the branches of laburnums and rose acacias framed the blue velvet curtains. The entire setting radiated peace, from the gentle sounds to Julie's serene smile. Monte Cristo, deeply moved by the atmosphere, fell silent. Lost in thought, he forgot to resume the conversation. The quiet lingered until he finally spoke, apologizing for his visible emotion. He admitted that such contentment was unfamiliar to him, and that he could not tire of observing the joy shared between Julie and Emmanuel. Julie acknowledged their happiness, but reminded him of the deep suffering they had once endured. The Count's curiosity intensified. Maximilian explained that their story, though humble, was filled with sorrow. Monte Cristo asked if divine grace had healed their wounds. Julie affirmed that it had, saying they had been blessed with an angel. The Count flushed and coughed, masking his reaction. Emmanuel reflected that true happiness is best understood by those who have endured hardship. Monte Cristo, unable to speak, rose and paced slowly, his emotions barely contained. Maximilian noticed and gently teased him about their modest grandeur. Monte Cristo, pale and trembling, pointed to a crystal case holding a silken purse, a letter, and a dazzling diamond. He asked about its meaning. Maximilian explained that these were their most treasured possessions, not for their monetary value, but for what they represented. The purse had once touched the hand of the man who saved their father from suicide, rescued them from ruin, and preserved their family's honor. Julie assured Monte Cristo that sharing the story brought them joy, not discomfort. They hoped that by speaking of their mysterious benefactor, they might one day uncover his identity. Maximilian lifted the glass cover, kissed the purse with reverence, and handed the letter to Monte Cristo. It had been written on the day their father nearly gave up hope. The diamond had been gifted to Julie as her dowry by the same unknown savior. Monte Cristo unfolded the letter and read it with a quiet joy that stirred deeply within him. It was the same letter addressed to Julie, signed by the mysterious Sinbad the sailor. He asked whether the man who had helped them remained unknown. Maximilian confirmed that they had never met him, though they had prayed for the chance. The entire event felt guided by an unseen force, powerful and inexplicable. Julie still held hope of one day kissing the hand that had touched the purse she now cherished. She recalled how Penelon, the old sailor turned gardener, had once seen an Englishman in Trieste. Penelon believed him to be the same man who had visited her father in June 1829 and written the letter in September, but he hadn't dared to approach him. Monte Cristo grew uneasy as Julie studied him closely. He repeated the detail. An Englishman? Maximilian explained that the man had claimed to be a clerk for Thomson and French in Rome, which had startled him when Monte Cristo mentioned that same firm as his bankers. He asked if the Count knew this Englishman. Monte Cristo noted that the firm had denied involvement, suggesting the man might have been repaying a forgotten kindness. Julie agreed that even a miracle seemed possible. When asked for the man's name, she said he had signed only as Sinbad the sailor. Monte Cristo observed that the name was clearly fictitious. Then, seeing Julie's reaction to his voice, he described the man's appearance, his height, his high cravat, his buttoned coat, and his habit of using a pencil. Julie's eyes lit up with hope, asking if he knew the man. Monte Cristo replied that he had only guessed. He mentioned Lord Wilmore, a man known for such anonymous acts of kindness. Julie was astonished that someone could be so generous without seeking recognition. Monte Cristo explained that Lord Wilmore didn't believe in gratitude, though perhaps he had since learned otherwise. Emmanuel asked if Monte Cristo knew where Lord Wilmore could be found. Julie pleaded to discover him, believing that if they could, he would finally understand the power of heartfelt gratitude. Monte Cristo, overwhelmed, turned away to hide his tears. Maximilian urged him to share anything he knew. The Count, struggling to contain his emotion, said that if Lord Wilmore had been their benefactor, they might never see him again. He had last seen him in Palermo, preparing to travel to distant lands. Julie, deeply moved, expressed her sorrow. Monte Cristo, gazing at her tearful face, said that if Lord Wilmore had witnessed such emotion, he would have found reason to remain in the world. He reached for Julie's hand, and she offered it willingly, drawn by the sincerity in his voice. She wondered aloud whether Lord Wilmore had family or friends who might help them find him. Monte Cristo replied that it was likely futile. Though they had been close, Lord Wilmore had shared no secrets. Julie pressed further, asking if there had been any clues. Monte Cristo insisted there had been none, though he had spoken of him instinctively. Maximilian gently intervened, reminding his sister of their father's belief that the man who saved them had not been English. Monte Cristo reacted with sudden intensity, asking Maximilian what his father had once told him. Maximilian explained that his father believed their rescue had been miraculous, as if a benefactor had risen from the grave to save them. Though Maximilian hadn't shared this belief, he had never dared to challenge it. His father often reflected on the event, speaking the name of a dear friend lost long ago. On his deathbed, with the clarity that sometimes comes near the end, that lingering doubt became certainty. His final words were, "Maximilian, it was Edmond Dantès." At the mention of that name, Monte Cristo's pallor deepened to an alarming degree. He was unable to respond. Glancing at his watch, as if suddenly reminded of time, he murmured a few words to Madame Herbault, then clasped the hands of Emmanuel and Maximilian. He asked permission to visit again, expressing sincere gratitude for their kindness. He admitted that it had been many years since he had allowed himself to feel so deeply. Without waiting for further reply, he quickly left the room. Emmanuel watched him go and remarked on the Count's unusual nature. Maximilian agreed, but insisted that Monte Cristo had a good heart and truly cared for them. Julie, still touched by the encounter, said that his voice had reached her soul, and that, more than once, it had sounded strangely familiar. About two-thirds of the way along the Faubourg Saint-Honoré, and behind one of the most imposing mansions in this wealthy quarter, a large garden stretched out where neighboring houses competed in elegant design and grand construction. Wide-spreading chestnut trees lifted their heads above the walls like a solid rampart. Each spring those trees scattered showers of delicate pink and white blossoms into the large stone vases that stood on the two square pilasters of a curiously wrought iron gate dating from the time of Louis XIII. That noble entrance, despite its striking appearance and the graceful effect of geraniums planted in the two vases which waved variegated leaves and displayed scarlet blooms, had fallen into complete disuse. Years earlier, the mansion's owners had decided to keep only the house itself with its densely planted courtyard opening onto the Faubourg Saint-Honoré and the garden enclosed by this gate. That garden once opened into a fine kitchen garden of about an acre, but the demon of speculation had drawn a line there and projected a street across the far side of the kitchen garden. The street was planned, given a name, and its plate posted. Yet before construction began, the owner imagined a handsome profit could be gained by building along the proposed line and making it a branch of communication with the important Faubourg Saint-Honoré. In matters of speculation, though people propose, it is money that decides. From similar difficulties, the newly named street died almost at birth. The buyer of the kitchen garden had paid a high price and could not find anyone willing to take the bargain without significant loss. still clinging to the belief that someday he would recover his outlay and the interest on the capital tied up in the plot. He contented himself with letting the ground temporarily to market gardeners for an annual rent of 500 francs. Thus, the iron gate leading into the kitchen garden had been closed and left to rust, which threatened soon to eat away its hinges. To prevent the ignoble glances of diggers and delvers from sullying the aristocratic enclosure, the gate had been boarded up to a height of 6 feet. The planks were not so closely fitted that a quick peep could not be taken through their gaps. Yet the strict decorum and rigid propriety of the house's inhabitants gave no reason to fear such advantages would be used. Horticulture seemed to have been abandoned in the deserted kitchen garden, where cabbages, carrots, radishes, peas, and melons had once flourished. Now only a scant crop of lucerne showed any sign of cultivation. A small low door provided an exit from the walled space into the projected street, the ground having been abandoned as unproductive by its renters and fallen so far in value that it returned not even half the percent it once paid. Towards the house, the chestnut trees rose high above the wall without hindering other luxuriant shrubs and flowers that pushed forward to fill vacant spaces, asserting their right to light and air. At one corner, the foliage grew so thick it almost shut out the day, and there a large stone bench with several rustic seats showed that the sheltered spot was favored or used by some resident of the house, which could just be made out through the dense greenery, though only 100 paces away. Whoever had chosen this secluded portion as a boundary for a walk or a place of meditation had ample reason to do so. There was no glare. The shade was cool and refreshing, and it sheltered from the sun's scorching rays even on the hottest summer days. The incessant, melodious warbling of birds and the complete removal from street noise and mansion bustle added to the appeal. On the evening of one of the warmest spring days Paris had yet seen, a book, a parasol, and a work basket with a partially embroidered cambric handkerchief hanging from it lay carelessly on the stone bench. A short distance from these items, a young woman stood close to the iron gate, peering through the openings in the planks to see what lay on the other side, her earnest stance and fixed gaze revealing how deeply her feelings were engaged in what she sought. At that instant, the small side gate leading from the waste ground to the street opened without a sound, and a tall, powerful young man appeared. He wore a common gray blouse and a velvet cap, yet his carefully arranged hair, beard, and mustache, all the richest and glossiest black, contrasted sharply with his plebeian attire. After casting a quick look around to make sure he was unobserved, he entered through the little gate, closed and secured it carefully behind him, and hurried toward the barrier. The young woman, seeing him, started in terror and was about to retreat, for she had expected him, though not in such costume. Even through the narrow chinks in the wooden palisade, the eye of love had already noticed the movement of a white robe and the flutter of a blue sash. Pressing his lips to the planks, he reassured her of his identity. The timid girl found courage to return to the gate and questioned him about his lateness and his odd dress, explaining that it was nearly dinner time and that she had used considerable diplomacy to evade her watchful stepmother, her too devoted maid, and her troublesome brother who teased her about neglecting her embroidery. She asked him to excuse the wait and to explain why she did not recognize him at first. The young man, aware of the difference in their social stations and fearing to offend by speaking plainly of his love, nevertheless confessed that he could not be in her presence without longing to pour out his soul and declare how deeply he adored her. He said that even the rebuke she had given left him a gleam of hope, since it proved he had been in her thoughts. He promised to explain frankly both his lateness and his disguise, and trusted in her goodness for pardon. He then told her he had chosen a trade, a decision that startled her and led her to plead that he not jest at a time of such serious uneasiness. He insisted he was not joking about something dearer to him than life, and asked her to listen as he explained. He had grown weary of roaming fields and scaling walls, and, alarmed by the danger that her father might imprison him as a thief if he were caught loitering about, he had resolved to adopt a legitimate calling. He argued that the continual presence of a Spahi captain where no military purpose could be supposed would arouse surprise. So he had become a gardener and taken on the costume of the trade to avoid suspicion. He had applied for the plot of ground that was to let, been readily accepted by the proprietor, and now considered himself master of the small crop of lucerne growing there. He rejoiced at the prospect of building a little hut on the plot and living within 20 yards of her, paying a modest rent of 500 francs per year, and believing that nothing would henceforth prevent him from placing a ladder against the wall and looking in when he pleased, or from assuring her of his faithful and unalterable affection, unless her pride rejected professions of love from a poor working man in blouse and cap. A faint cry escaped Valentine, part pleasure and part surprise, and she almost immediately fell into a saddened tone, as though a cloud of envy dimmed the joy lighting her heart. She declared that the plan could not be pursued for many reasons, warning that they might overestimate their strength and, like others, be misled by blind confidence in each other's prudence. Maximilian reacted with incredulous tenderness, questioning how she could entertain such an unworthy thought toward him, and he reminded her that from the first blessed hour of their acquaintance, he had shaped his words and actions to match her sentiments and ideas. He insisted she fully trusted his honor and recounted how, when she had spoken of a vague sense of impending danger, he had devoted himself blindly to her service and asked no reward beyond the pleasure of being useful, asking whether he had ever, by word or look, given her cause for regret for choosing him among many who would have sacrificed their lives for her. Valentine replied that Maximilian's very devotion made him bold and left her both happy and unhappy, causing her to question whether it was better to endure her stepmother's severity and blind preference for her own child, or to continue living for the few dangerous meetings that gave her any pleasure. Maximilian rejected her, calling his actions trifling, calling that word cruel and unjust, and he pointed out his obedience to her limits. She had permitted him occasional conversation, but forbade following her on walks, and he had complied. He noted that when he found a way to enter the enclosure and exchange a few words through the gate, being close without truly seeing her, he had never once sought to touch the hem of her gown or to pass the barrier, and no complaint or murmur had escaped him. He compared his fidelity to the vows of knights of old and urged her to confess the truth rather than be called unjust. Valentine acknowledged the truth as she slipped the tips of her slender fingers through a small opening in the planks and allowed Maximilian to press his lips to them. Yet she added that he had acted from self-interest, for he knew that if he showed an opposite spirit, all would end between them. She explained that she had no friend on earth but him, neglected by her father, harassed by her stepmother, and tormented by a troublesome brother, left only in the company of a paralyzed, speechless old man whose withered hand could no longer press her as though his eyes still held warmth for his grandchild. She depicted her fate as bitter, serving as victim or enemy to stronger people, while her sole supporter seemed a living corpse. And she insisted that if Maximilian loved her, it must be out. Of pity, Maximilian, deeply moved, refused to claim that she was his entire world, for he also valued his sister and brother-in-law with calm affection unlike his passion for Valentine, and he confessed that thoughts of her made his heart race, set his blood burning, and made breathing difficult. He solemnly promised to restrain his ardor, fervor, and intensity until she required him to put them at her service. And he noted that Franz was not expected home for a year, during which favorable chances might arise. He urged them to hope, calling hope a sweet comforter, and asked Valentine, while reproaching him with selfishness, to consider what she had been to him, the beautiful but cold resemblance of a marble Venus, making no promise of future reward for all his submission and obedience, which had amounted to scarcely anything in return. He recalled her engagement to M. Franz d'Épinay and her aversion to the prospect of being his wife, and he pressed her to reveal whether some other sorrow dwelt in her heart. He declared his complete devotion, body and soul, life, and every warm drop in his heart consecrated to her service, and warned that his existence was bound up with hers so tightly that losing her would leave him unable to outlive the hour of such crushing misery. He lamented her calm speak of marrying another and imagined, had he been in her place and conscious of being so adored, that he would have reached through the iron bars 100 times to clasp her hand and declare himself hers alone forever. The poor girl did not answer aloud, but her lover clearly heard her sobs and felt the change sweep through him. He begged her forgiveness and asked her to forget any words that might have caused pain. She explained, in a broken voice, that she was a poor, helpless being, almost a stranger and an outcast in her father's house where he was rarely seen. She described a will thwarted and spirits broken from the age of 10 beneath an iron rod held sternly over her, oppressed, mortified, and persecuted day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, without anyone caring for or even observing her suffering, and she added that she had never spoken of it to anyone but him. Outwardly to the world, she was surrounded by kindness and affection, yet the reality was the reverse. The common remark excused her father's sternness and praised Madame de Villefort as a second mother. But this was mistaken, for her father abandoned her from utter indifference, while her stepmother detested her with a hatred the more terrible for being veiled beneath a continual smile. The young man could not conceive how anyone could hate Valentine, and expressed his astonishment. She answered that her stepmother's aversion sprang from a natural cause, an overweening love for her own child, Edward. She conceded she did not know all the reasons, and though reluctant to bring money into the conversation, she admitted that the root of the dislike lay there. She feared her stepmother envied the fortune she held by right of her mother, a fortune that would increase at the death of M. and Madame de Saint-Méran, of whom she was sole heiress. She said Madame de Villefort had nothing of her own and hated her for being richly endowed, and she confessed she would gladly exchange half her wealth for the happiness of sharing her father's love, even prefer to sacrifice it all for a truly affectionate home. He uttered a tender pity for her. She said she felt as though living in bondage, yet so conscious of her own weakness that she feared to break the restraint for fear of falling utterly helpless. She reminded him that her father could not have his orders opposed with impunity because his high position and established reputation for talent and integrity protected him, and that no one could oppose him, for he was powerful even with the king and could crush the lover at a word. She begged Maximilian to believe that if she did not resist her father's commands, it was more for his sake than her own. He asked why she persisted in imagining the worst and painting so gloomy a future. She said she judged from the past. He urged her to consider that, though not an illustrious match by strict social rules, he was not so wholly beneath her alliance. Distinctions were no longer weighed as before, and the first families of the monarchy had intermarried with those of the empire, the aristocracy of the lance allied with the nobility of the cannon. He belonged to that latter class and expected favorable military preferment. His small fortune was free and unfettered, and the memory of his late father was respected as that of an upright and honorable merchant in their country, which he noted was also where she had been born, not far from Marseilles. Valentine pleaded with him not to speak of Marseilles, for the name recalled her mother, her angel mother who had died too soon and whom she hoped watched over her from heaven. She believed that if her mother were alive, there would be nothing to fear, for she would have told her mother of the love and would have been protected. He replied that, had her mother lived, he might never have had the happiness of knowing her, for she would have been too happily elevated to stoop to give him a thought. Valentine called him unjust, but then asked a question she hesitated to frame, requesting to know truly whether, in former days when their fathers dwelt at Marseilles, there had been any misunderstanding between them. He said not that he knew, except perhaps ill-feeling arising from opposing political parties. Her father is zealous Bourbon partisan, while his had been devoted to the emperor, no other difference being likely. She then related why she asked. On the day his appointment as an officer of the Legion of Honor appeared in the papers, they had been sitting with her grandfather, Noirtier, and M. Danglars had been present. While others discussed the approaching marriage of Mademoiselle Danglars, she had been reading the paper to her grandfather, and when she reached the paragraph about him, she felt so happy and nervous at speaking his name aloud before so many people that she had almost passed it over, only reading it for fear of arousing suspicion by her silence, and she summoned the courage to read it steadily. At the sound of his name, her father had turned hastily and, knitting his brows into a deep frown, expressed the belief that this moral could not be related to the Marseilles family associated with violent Bonapartism around 1815. Danglars agreed he believed him to be the son of the old shipowner. When Maximilian asked what her father said next, she avoided the worst of it, though she had promised to tell him all. She recounted her father's brutal political outburst about the emperor treating such men as food for cannon and praised the government's vigor in that spirit, a remark she acknowledged as brutal, but which Maximilian dismissed as mere partisan talk and compared to similar rhetoric from his own father that was no less aggressive. She described M. Danglars' half-malicious, half-ferocious laugh and his abrupt departure, and how, for the first time, she had observed agitation in her grandfather's paralyzed frame, a sentiment she alone could perceive and which she believed indicated the conversation had pained him because he loved the emperor so devotedly. Maximilian interposed that M. Noirtier's name was celebrated across Europe and noted his leading role in Bonapartist conspiracies during the Restoration, and Valentine, reflecting on the oddity of father and son holding opposite political loyalties, resumed her tale. She had looked toward her grandfather to read his feeling and asked if he was pleased. He answered yes to the paper's news of Morel's honor and no to the preceding remarks of her father and M. Danglars. She treasured the old man's pleasure at hearing that a stranger like Morel had been made an officer of the Legion of Honor, and she admitted it might be a whim of failing memory, yet she loved him for that interest. Maximilian murmured at the strangeness of politics, causing such divergent feelings between father and grandfather. Suddenly she exclaimed that someone was coming, and Maximilian leapt into his lucerne crop and began to pull up plants as if weeding. A voice called out that Madame was searching for her because a visitor had arrived in the drawing room, a grand personage identified as the Count of Monte Cristo. Valentine promptly replied that she would come immediately. The name of Monte Cristo triggered an electric shock through Maximilian because Valentine's "I am coming" was their customary farewell signal. Leaning on his spade, he admitted he would give a good deal to know how the Count of Monte Cristo came to be acquainted with the Villefort. And so, another chapter comes to a close, but the story is far from over. Every choice, every whisper, every heartbeat still echoes, waiting to be heard again. If this journey moved you, inspired you, or simply kept you company for a while, take a moment to support the channel. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions help us bring more timeless stories to life, one episode at a time. We'll meet again soon, in a world of courage, love, and destiny, because every great story deserves to be heard and remembered.